Hello and welcome. My name is Manesh Samtani. I'm the editor at Regulation Asia. On behalf of Regulation Asia, I'd like to introduce our panelists and speakers. They're going to discuss culture and conduct, which have become increasingly relevant in the regulatory landscape in recent years. So first off, I'd like to introduce Jason Lee, Managing Director and Head of Regulatory and Compliance at Temasek, Singapore's sovereign wealth fund. So Jason has experience across derivatives, banking, securities, regulation, technology, data, commodities, carbon trading, and so on. He also has experience conducting misconduct investigations and drafting internal compliance procedures and codes. So I'd like to welcome Jason.
So, good afternoon, everyone.
Excellent. Next, we have Wendy Ennis, Head of Financial Crime Compliance at Mox Bank. Originally from Canada, Wendy has worked in Asia for 18 years. Prior to joining Mox, she was the Regional Head of Business Advisory and Governance at Standard Chartered. And before that, she spent some time with JP Morgan, GE, American Express, in various senior roles. Welcome, Wendy. Glad to have you.
Pleased to be here. Thank you.
You're welcome. And also we have Kate Miller, Head of Conduct and Behavioral Analysis at Standard Chartered Bank. Kate leads a multidisciplinary team in the pursuit of applying behavioral science methodologies at her bank, focusing on behaviors that deliver the best customer outcomes, improve workplace culture, enhance risk management, and encourage more sustainable decision-making. Welcome, Kate. Keen to hear more about this.
Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone.
And finally, our moderator for the session, who I'd like to thank for joining us today, Tom Reeder, Associate Professor of Organizational Psychology at the London School of Economics, where he directs the MSc in Organizational and Social Psychology programs and leads an executive course on organizational culture. So Tom's research focuses on how norms and behaviors relating to risk management, team working, and ethical conduct emerge in organizations and contribute to outcomes. Earlier this year, the Bank of England published a paper that Tom authored on organizational culture and bank risk. And I know this work was cited in the Association of Banks in Singapore in its practice note on culture and conduct dashboards. On another note, Tom is also an advisor to Starling, a US RegTech, which applies behavioral science, machine learning, and network analytics to identify and mitigate culture and conduct risks. So again, on behalf of Regulation Asia, I want to welcome you, Tom. Thank you for moderating this session. And without further ado, let me turn the floor over to our experts, starting with Tom to set the scene for the discussion. Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you very much, Manesh, and thanks for inviting me to the session. My background has been studying organizational culture and risk culture in fields such as aviation, healthcare, and nuclear power. And although when things go wrong in the financial industries, things don't physically blow up, there is a similarity between the types of cultural issues that lead to accidents and those that lead to financial crime and failure in financial institutions. And in particular, the identifying the drivers of poor culture and ways to measure culture is quite often done in domains such as aviation and healthcare. And I think increasingly you're seeing it in the financial industries. And that's what we're going to explore a bit today, the nature of culture and financial crime, and perhaps ways that institutions can monitor and improve their culture. So first, and just to set the scene, there has been a tendency for, I think, regulators and organizations to focus on inputs and outputs when monitoring organizations and potential for financial crime. But in recent months, years, and I think it's discussed in the Starling report on culture at some length, regulators are increasingly focusing upon throughputs, and culture is one of those throughputs. And I wonder what has led to global regulators focusing upon culture in particular in financial crime? And perhaps I could start with Wendy on that question.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. And looking forward to this conversation today. If I think about the position from global financial regulators, so large bank fines started around 2008. But I think if we look back at those consent orders and the subsequent investigations that we've seen from, both journalists and banking regulators over the years, they've called out the lack of accountability of banks to encourage staff to set the right culture. And as we look at, even some of the wording in these consent orders or in global investigations that have taken place, there have been comments from employees that have played a prominent role in these consent orders, giving comments about a gap in culture, and not even from a sense of best in class, but a basic sense of what employees feel that they can or are encouraged to do. So are they encouraged to do the right thing? We've seen comments in some consent orders saying employees felt pressure to perform to a certain level. And that's not necessarily from a culture, driving the right culture, but more from a business focus. Comments like, they all knew we were doing this. This is industry practice. So, of course, this led to negative perceptions of the banking industry. And we suffered, incredible reputational risk. And that has continued through the years. We're certainly seen as the front line of defense against criminal activity. So from a regulator's perspective, they understandably see banks have an obligation to lead with purpose and ultimately drive a culture that supports appropriate decision-making throughout the entire organization. I think regulators are aware that the culture of compliance needs a framework that's tangible. And so they talk about, that framework of systems, processes, adequate staffing levels, and very importantly, the message or tone from the top. But of course, I think they're also aware that a culture is a little bit softer, a little bit harder to measure. It's that set of values and beliefs at both, that individual and collective level. And you can tick the box on all of those, earlier framework, in terms of having your systems and your processes, but without that being glued or directly tied to an effective, healthy organizational culture, ultimately a financial institution will continue to see undesirable behaviors. I think, good compliance culture allows the employees to have opinions and voice them. So this is where regulators, speak about the psychological safety or the requirement to speak up. And I think we still have some way to go in terms of protecting people who speak up in the industry. But I think ultimately regulators, and I think this is presented through tone from the top in most organizations. But certainly regulators want to see a culture that is sustainable. This is a continual work in progress from a culture perspective. They want to see this tone from the top. I'd argue it's also equally as important, the tone from the middle. But of course, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit more as we go through the hour, but regulation ultimately, it has a limited role to play given that it can't be mandated. So it's again a continual work in progress. There's challenges to measure it, but you cannot have an effective framework in place without ensuring that culture is part of that. So it's going hand in hand with the systems and the processes and the people.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. I think that's absolutely right. And Kate, I'm going to put this to you. Is there a danger sometimes with culture that and I think you're, I'm a culture academic, and I think you're saying this very gently, Wendy, but it can seem a bit woolly, right? And it can seem like a bit of a grab bag for lots of things. Kate, how do you think culture is understood in the industry? Is it understood in quite a woolly, so it's a bit it's a bit everything, or is it understood as a sort of sharp phenomenon? How would you say it's described and understood?
Yeah, look, I think I would say it has most definitely been kind of that woolly parameter that we can't always kind of wrap our hands around. But as human beings, we see it, we feel it, it's kind of happening all around us day to day. I've often wondered as well, within a financial crime specific context where there is such black and white, there is a lot of legislation specifically saying what can and can't be done, and therefore I sort of wonder whether because there's so much grey in culture, the two have had trouble in the past, like sort of finding good connections potentially. But yeah, I think we're getting closer to understanding it better. I think it's, to Wendy's point, I think it's a constant activity. So I don't think you ever truly understand the culture. I think it's constantly evolving, but we start to get closer to a better understanding, closer to the truth with new techniques, some of which hopefully we'll kind of cover today, new and different ways of kind of talking about it and thinking about it.
Yeah, and Jason, your perspective on culture from sort of the non-regulatory angle. What are your thoughts on sort of its description? Is it sort of woolly? Is it something that is sort of fairly solid as something to study and observe?
Yeah, just a couple of observations there, Tom. In terms of the buzzwords of culture and conduct and financial crime, that's unfortunately not the provenance of the regulated banking industry or the financial industry. We've seen a high proportion of the FCPA fines coming in the aviation industry, mining industries, and so on, and no shortage of any of the securities violations themselves, not predominantly coming from the banking and financial industry. So banking financial industry has taken a lot of the heat, as Wendy mentioned, from 2008 and coming out of the last crisis. But again, they don't have monopoly on bad behavior. So let's put that to the side. And I think it's actually important because as we've seen the regulation, where you have regulated entities, culture and conduct becomes an issue because you have different stakeholders, and some of the stakeholders are beyond your shareholders, become customers in the community which you engage in, and that becomes important. And you have regulators who regulate you on a daily basis. Now, on the non-regulated entities, the general corporates, there's a tendency, I think, for people to go, we're not regulated, so maybe that's less of an issue, and so on. And it becomes so people take their foot off the pedal. But we've seen before, it's important. In fact, I think it's probably even more important to have structures around enforcing appropriate culture within the non-FI, simply because you don't have the regulator on you every day looking at you setting up programs, setting up your DPAs and so on. It's actually a bit more important, in my view, to actually have a strong culture within the non-corporates, because in financial crime, you're also going to be subject to sanctions if that happens. So that's my perspective, and I think it's important. I agree that part of it feels a bit woolly, and I think that's a perception of people who haven't been at the pointy end of a misconduct investigation or FCPA or DOJ action. But make no mistake about it, that's really important.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and of course, culture is at the one time we're thinking about it related to crime. It's very specific, but it's something that we all experience culture in different moments within organisations, and it's just about the sort of common ways of doing things. And often when you study a crime or any misconduct, the people engaging it didn't necessarily, even though they knew it was wrong, they didn't think of it as wrong. I think that's probably something you quite commonly find, and that's because it shapes how we understand things. And that really leads to my second question, which is that psychological studies of crime itself often distinguish between bad apples, so that's sort of individual tendencies, greed, personality, and bad barrels, which is the culture. And I wonder, and I think interventions, even though we talk a lot about culture, they all do seem to focus a bit on the bad apples, actually, and trying to capture them. And I wonder to what extent the barrel really is the actual driver of crime. So we're thinking here about individuals and cultures. And if so, if the barrels are the drivers of crime, what would you say the main cultural aspects are that lead to financial crime? Like, what are the cultural qualities that really matter? Kate, could I put that question to you first, please?
Sure. So I think that the focus of the financial services industry since 2008 has been quite focused on intentional or kind of willful misconduct type of issues. And often these are concentrated to an individual or potentially a small group of individuals. Yet the reality of what we tend to see day in, day out are kind of these structural misconduct, or you might want to refer to it as kind of like misconduct by design, which are issues that we see more frequently, and they really manifest as a result of the context and the working environment. So it's like what actually happens versus what was designed and what was put in place to be undertaken. And I think these types of issues are potentially more concerning for firms because they open a window to the culture, and they often happen consistently over time unless there's some sort of intervention, a series of culture interventions. So yeah, I think I prescribe to the barrel, the barrel idea. I think that we're predominantly social animals, social beings, and I think we shape our behaviour relative to the context that we're in. A couple of like examples relative to financial crime specific context might be that we have kind of processes and procedures that aren't detective enough for the types of risks in intermediaries that you would want to think about from an ABC perspective, or maybe your external fraud risk detection is not suitable around trade activities. But one of the other things which I think is really interesting is where we've actually you create processes and controls that don't, and procedures that don't make sense in practice. And then you have people that they might be time consuming or arduous, and you kind of have people that find ways to circumvent these processes and procedures, to your point around, really thinking that they're doing the right thing, but they're sort of just looking for the fastest way to kind of get something done.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, I think. And one of the key differences I've observed between the financial industries and the other, what I call sort of safety critical industries, is just that the benefit of risk taking in those industries is much less than in the financial industry, where an element of risk taking is required. And Jason, this is a good question I'm going to ask you. Is that is there a danger of almost sometimes sort of two cultures emerging within organizations, or two tracks of culture, one which is around getting better return, making more profit, and then the other around being ethical and not taking too much risk and all of these things? And that actually, from the experience on the ground, which is where things occur inside of an organization, it's on the day-to-day, that people actually have sort of almost two messages sometimes that they're getting from the organization. And even though organizations may be saying actually compliance and conduct is really, really important, implicitly they're getting this message that it's not quite as important as other things. Do you think that's the case? And if so, how can that be managed?
I think that's a very good question, Tom. And I'll just put some context into this. There was a study done, I believe, with the trade association and possibly Oliver Wyman, and they looked at market misconduct over 300 years. Looked at 200 of the incidents, and they found that within that there were 25 sorts of destructive behaviors which were consistent, right, over 300 years in the market itself. So I would like to say that unfortunately it's a human nature and we'll talk about behavioral science in a bit, but again, it's something which is predominant in industry for a prolonged period. So the choice you to go back to your question, the choice it's a choice which people face throughout the industry, throughout whether it's meeting sales targets to sell widgets or meeting sales targets to sell derivatives. It's a constant issue and battle which people have faced over the years, right? Mm-hmm. So how do you come about it and say one thing and you mean something else? I think it goes back again to how you set up your vision and value. So if you look at the whole culture process, right? If it's a very linear process, you decide what's your vision, what's your purpose inside, and then who are your stakeholders and what you deliver to them, and how you go about setting up your conduct to deliver this to them, and then you have a bunch of metrics to measure the output at the end, right? So it's slightly bit more complicated, but by and large, that's the flow. how you balance these discussions, how you make the choices at the appropriate places, is actually the baseline. Is you go back to what your culture says, right? It's the easiest said and done. We're not going to do this because this is the risk. You'd be surprised again how many times this conversation appears in DPAs, in chart sheets, where they will say there was this meeting and people decided to do this or ignored it, and then it sometimes appears in a billboard or dashboard by the DOJ when they announce a settlement. It's a constant trend, and I only can say that it's how you make the decision is framed by the culture and the vision which you have within the firm. And ultimately, Tom, we say and this is the point about bad barrels and so on, right? If the place actually has a toxic culture and people are willing to take the risk and disregard the benefits, then it's a question of actually someone walking out, putting up their hand, or becoming a whistleblower, or making a report. And that itself is a segue on how people are supposed to behave and create the appropriate culture. So to summarize again, one, this sort of trade-offs is something which has happened throughout. It's nothing new. And it's actually how you make a decision is actually anchored by the culture within the firm. And for the individual itself, it's a decision to make whether that's the right place to be.
Yes, and of course we talk about culture, but ultimately as individuals doing things. And Wendy, I wonder from the compliance perspective, is it easier in a way to monitor the individual than the culture? We're going to come on to culture measurement in a minute, but from the compliance perspective, I guess it will always be a bit easier to focus on individual acts than studying a culture overall.
Can I just add a comment to what Jason was saying as well, though, sure. Just to link into that point. And I think what Kate has also said around people being, we're social creatures, and so we have to pay attention to these interpersonal relationships that are happening within the organization, and then to Jason's point around culture and whether or not it's a toxic environment. So when we hire within organizations, and that's not just specific to FCC, we often look for cultural fit. And so what you need to look at from a cultural fit perspective is, what is my culture? And do I want people to fit into this culture? Because do I have the right culture? And if not, if I'm bringing in a more diverse organization, which we should be, not just from identity, but from cognition as well, have I set up people to step outside of that cultural fit if they need to be to say something? Specific to your question of, was it looking at, the cultural problems we should be looking at? And look, it's, again, we've been talking a little bit, culture is hard to measure, but it's not impossible to measure. So if we want to look at some of the telltale signs of how do we measure culture within the organization, some of it is, how do you manage your program? How are you talking to your employees? What are you saying to them about the behaviors of, who are you when no one is looking? How are you having those types of conversations with your employees? To an extent, it can be, you can measure your, measure to be aware if you have cultural problems. And that depends sometimes how technologically savvy your organization is. If you use Slack, for example, or Glassdoor, or exit interviews from HR, that's varying levels of sophistication around technology, but it's a really good way to get a sense of what current or ex-employees are saying about the culture at your organization. But I think what's important, so one of the things, that I think we should be looking at in terms of culture is, often it's not malicious behavior. Sometimes it is, but often it's not. It's a slip of standards or a movement towards accepted behaviors that sit outside of what we'd want people to do. And I think we need to be aware whether or not our people are set up for success or set up for failure. So to start with, within a compliance organization, but much more broadly than that, when is culture and conduct discussed? Is it as part of a training? Is it once a year during your reviews, or twice a year during your reviews? Or is it something that is part of your continual conversation? So it's not just about, we've got a conduct form, we discuss or we talk about culture, how it's important when we're looking to recruit people. But we always look at this as part of an ongoing conversation. I think certainly within COVID times and the shift that we've seen kind of across the world in terms of how our organizations have been set up. If you haven't been having conversations with your team about culture or challenges, then you should immediately do that. You should assume that people are facing challenges. So I think part of looking at that culture and cultural problems that may exist is looking at what's your environment right now? Are there oversight challenges? Do you have reduced workforce in some of your areas? Are people facing that pressure? Are they in a heightened risk environment, which we've all been, certainly in the banking industry since last year? Are hiring or training or management taking place remotely over long periods of time? And how have you shifted your organization to think about that impact of culture? Especially, going back to COVID, some of us have had to move to long-term BCP types of environments in some countries. So have maker checker workflows been impacted operationally? And so how are you encouraging people to speak up, to talk about challenges that they're facing in terms of doing their jobs? Is communication taking place outside of official systems or official environments? Are people having conversations where information could slip? Because again, all of that could have an impact on cultural problems that you may start to have. And I think by starting to look at that, you can start seeing some telltale signs. And again, conversations we should be having to understand people's limitations, remind employees about if there's a change in environment, how we deal with that from a cultural perspective in terms of still maintaining the standards that we want. And then I think, look, it's about really a big piece of this is communicating with your team. And some of that is just even in a day-to-day, putting aside an exceptional environment. Are you sitting down and talking to your team about how they take decisions? Are you asking them to explain their rationale? Or are you the type of organization that says, don't come to me with problems, come to me with solutions? Hopefully we've all moved away from that one, but it was a big buzz phrase in the 90s, I feel. But, or are you saying to your employees, tell me how you came to decisions? Because I think that's a really good way to get people to start practicing their thought processes and how they should be applying the skills around the right behaviors in their day-to-day jobs.
Yes, and I mean, there's a couple of things you say there which are really quite important. The first, actually going back to something you talked about that sort of normalization of Dan Vaughan calls it the normalization of deviance, which is where a one-off shortcut becomes standardized, right? And then it actually becomes hardwired into the performance of the organization. And people can't stop taking the shortcut, because if they stop taking the shortcut, they don't perform as well. And that's the kind of thing that's very difficult actually for an institution to pick up on. What we find as psychologists is that it's easier to pick up on what's termed an error of commission. So when someone makes a bad decision, rather than an error of omission, is where people aren't doing things. People don't report not doing things. And so there's different types of cultural problems, I think, that emerge. And so I think that sort of point about that normalization process is important. I think the other thing you're saying, which is important and leads on to what we're going to talk about in a second, is just that how do you pick up on the culture? And I mean, there's two ways you pick up on the culture, really. One is you actively trying to find out about the culture by going and asking people and surveying them and doing all of these things. And then the other is you are trying to listen to the mood music of the organization, the things that people are saying spontaneously, naturally, the things that come to their minds. And I think that's where behavioral science is becoming very important. So, for example, things like Slack channels and the like. What are people talking about when no one's there or they're not being asked about culture? That's as revealing of culture as a culture survey is. And that leads me to my next question, which is around taking those telltale signs that you were discussing, Wendy, and making them quite concrete and trying to measure culture in a more standardized way that allows you to benchmark a culture. Jason, I'll come to you. Do you think it's possible to measure a culture? And if you can measure a culture, and this is where behavioral science is obviously useful, what might the downsides and upsides of that be?
Yeah, so Tom, I think that's a really interesting question, because just to recap and set the baseline, well, a culture, if you take it to mean the norms and values of an organization, that's pretty intangible itself, right? So how do you what do you do with that, right? Beyond what you can look, the way you probably will look at it is that conduct is a series of actions, which is actually a manifestation of the culture itself, right? So if you have a culture which is intangible, and you think of an iceberg, 1/8 of it is below the water, and that manifests itself in 1/8 on the conduct on the top of the water, and that's waterline, and that's where you actually focus your energy and attention on, is to look at the actual manifestation of the culture itself, and how you the series of action emanating from the organization itself is a telltale sign of its culture. It's pretty hard to have a value system which doesn't translate into observable behaviors, because culture itself drives what is acceptable in an organization and what's not. So if you take that as the base case, where you have the cultural intangible leading to conduct, which is actions, then you get a bit easier to do things, because one, you actually can do a series of interventions to steer the conduct into certain ways, right? So that's a bit of behavioral science and remediation. I'll come back to that. But just on detecting itself, detecting what the culture is, and as Wendy mentioned, you could do it in a number of ways, right? And it's either the surveys, in-out surveys, monitoring of the dashboards, communication channels, looking at the numbers of complaints, issues raised, and so on. So it's a holistic 360, and with the advancements in AI and machine learning, you probably actually could make more detailed and granular analysis of this. Even though, for example, check-in and check-out times, that could also lead to a culture where people are overworked, or you find people actually congregating at certain points in a transaction, right? Maybe it's predominantly at the start, maybe they're putting in too much work there and slack off at the end. So that could lead to certain investigative points in terms of what you do. But in on the human intervention side, if you really want to do it, you can try and set up your environment in a way which actually promotes a healthy culture. So for example, right, Tom, if you have a situation where this is the culture, these are the set of values that we want people to do, and we're not there yet, what you can do is try to use behavioral science, which is the science of how people make decisions in the real environment, to steer them towards the outcomes you want. Now, it says that probably about 95% of our choices are done on a rule of thumb or automatic, and that's done within a concept called the choice architecture. So trying to design your choice architecture itself will enable you to steer certain decisions in a particular way. So I'll give you an example: loss aversion. You know, there's always a tendency for humans itself to put more weightage on avoiding bad outcomes than trying to do something to get good outcomes. And the way you would design something is to give incentive, right? A good outcome, if you want people to raise their hand if they see something going wrong and there's misconduct happening, to actually report that. And the way you would try and combine that is to put a negative outcome, and if you don't do that, for example, then you are penalized, and that's actually something which is on you. So by balancing these things and making choice architecture in a way, designing these things, you can actually use a bit of human psychology and behavioral science to get the outcomes you want. So to summarize again, culture itself you can measure not through directly, but through the conduct, which is a manifestation of the culture, and you can use behavioral science actually to intervene to steer the conduct into the ways that you want to be aligned with the values.
Yeah, and I think there are many possible interventions. I mean, one of the most powerful interventions in healthcare is something like the surgical checklist, which you may be familiar with, you know, which is a very simple paper-based intervention, which is before going into surgery, clinicians check that they're treating the right patient and check what's going on, and they check that risks have been thought of, and they have timeouts during the surgical environment. And you know, that's had a huge effect, not just on clinical outcomes, but also on what people think their role is within a team, and something like psychological safety to ask a question or to raise a concern. But in terms of culture measurement, I mean, something that I'm concerned that sometimes is that culture measurement can end up just being a metric that it sort of feeds into the pot of measurements which are to be managed. And sometimes, and I won't say which organizations, but sometimes organizations I've worked with are worried to do a culture survey or culture work in case it looks bad, in case there's a problem, you know. And it's almost like if we start asking about the culture, maybe we'll actually find something we don't like. Wendy, what are your thoughts on that? Are there some downsides of trying to formally scale culture and benchmark it and measure it?
So I would say you're probably best to do both. So like most risks that we look at, there is a level of subjectivity to the approach that we take. But having a framework in place where you have so similar to the checklist that you mentioned, where you have a checklist in place, that gives you a bit of a stopgap. So where could we potentially have failures around our culture? And, you know, I think tying into what Jason is saying, how is it manifesting? Are we seeing in any particular areas, is it manifesting negatively or positively? And so we could take that as some level of litmus test. But if you simply rely on the checklist, and you don't also consider, so again, it's those informal conversations. And so I still think you can build a framework around that. If you think about a manager coming into the organization and driving culture, you could say to the manager, this is how we measure culture within the organization. So we have very specific checkpoints or areas where we have conversations with employees, and they are encouraged to do X type of behavior. As a manager, you're also expected to lead. And so part of that is ensuring that you have an environment where you're following up with how this is landing subjectively, qualitatively with your employees, with your team. So I think you can have both of it. I think if you try and be too qualitative or subjective, in terms of your approach for culture, you may not have everybody will manage it slightly differently. Yeah. If you simply rely on a checklist type of approach, people will just say, well, I've ticked the box, it's fine, it's done. People are just going to answer. So I'm not really getting a true sense of what's going on. So I think, look, like most things in life, you have your stopgaps, you have your checklist to manage certain milestones. But we also, I would say, we adult around the other stuff, and we ask the important questions, and we try and get quality answers from how it's landing with our teams. Easier said than sometimes.
It is, and Kate, I'm going to come to you because I think one thing that I've been a little bit struck by, particularly with the financial firms, I think, is actually they have mounds of data for studying culture. There's no shortage of information, and it depends a little bit, I think, on how you think of culture. I think you're right, Wendy. You could see it's very qualitative, and it's about running observations and such like, and it is that. But it's also looking at aspects of behavior or language or whatever that you think reveal the culture. Kate, what type of data do you think most organizations are sitting on that they could right now see as lending itself to culture measurement?
Yeah, I mean, like, so interesting. And I think that this is like really the kind of next generation of like internal analysis, and certainly motivated by research like yours, Tom. I mean, you are such an expert, and Tom has championed a concept of unobtrusive indicators of culture, which is really looking at, a whole suite of available data. His I mean, your projects have been kind of looking outside in, but within organizations, you can sort of replicate that approach and think about, how are decisions actually made. I mean, to your point earlier, Wendy, where you asked the question of, tell me how you came to that decision, we can kind of ask that question, tell me how you came to that decision within a risk meeting by, creating some text analysis models and running some text analysis over meeting minutes. So we can look at, a year's worth of risk decisions and kind of meeting minutes and start to kind of get an understanding of exactly kind of what's happening within the organization outside of what people might be telling us within a survey. Because we know that, surveys, even with the very best of intentions, surveys don't predict behaviour. They might correlate with certain behaviours that we want to see, but they're not causally linked. So we definitely need to think about, all of these alternative means. And given that we've had such advancements in the last, number of years with AI, there's a lot more kind of conversant individuals within organizations, and in general there's a lot more capability within organizations to kind of think about looking at some of these data sets differently. We did one thing recently where we looked at kind of sentiment analysis that was coming up through different meetings that occur within the organisation, and when people raise questions and ask questions of senior leadership, and kind of what that kind of tells us about, how people are thinking and feeling at a given time. So I think that there's I think we're just sort of at the beginning of this new wave, really, which is very exciting.
Yeah, I think so. And one thing, and it's this will be a question to all of you actually. One thing that I think it's a problem of how we study culture and psychology often is that we try to take an average of a culture, and we're sort of Standard Chartered, you are 4.2, and you are 4.1, and then we try it out, we try to discern meaning from it. And I'm not sure. On one hand, that's useful because it allows you to benchmark yourself, right, and to see where you sit. On the other hand, it can sometimes mask problems, because I think that's when you see financial crime, it's often located in small sort of pockets. And one of the things that I've been struck by in many industries when studying culture is, and it's a finding that at LSE we've been able to evidence in healthcare actually, quite powerfully, I think, through comparing the culture data collected from staff and measuring culture through the observations of patients and families through complaints that they write to hospitals. And what you find is that as the culture gets worse inside of a hospital or organization, people less willing to speak up, poor behavior is normalized, the culture measurements or the measurements you're using to pick up on problems become less reliable, and they don't really work. And so you can actually get a sort of positive data that looks positive, but you can't always trust it, because that, well, if people are engaging in lots of unethical acts, they're not going to suddenly start reporting on it in a survey. I wonder, this is to all of you, perhaps, Kate, we'll start with you. How do you get around that problem, do you think, where your measurements are actually tapping into what's going on? They're not just measurements that capture what people want you to think is going on.
That was me to start.
Yeah, but we can go to everybody on this.
No problem. So look, I think with this potentially woolly construct that we're talking about, culture, I think it's trying to think about as many potential data sets that are available, and trying to think about how you triangulate all of those different perspectives together to get a better understanding of the types of dimensions and areas of interest that you're focused on. So I think that there are there's a lot of information that we have internally that we've never previously looked at through that lens, but also, to your point, the outside perspective. So how do you bring those kind of outside views into the organisation, and how do you sort of make them resonate in a way that it really starts to change, improve people's understanding and change awareness over time.
Yeah, because I think sometimes outsiders will just, they can tell you things that are painful. As an academic, our students sometimes tell us things that are quite painful. We think we're amazing teachers, and they may have a different view on things. But ultimately, even if you think you are doing a good job, at the very least, there's a communication problem, right, and a perceptual problem. And I think you're right there about the fact that it's maybe not about one indicator or the other indicators. It's about a set of indicators, and what you're interested in is, are they all pointing in the same direction or not, or do they all point? And if there are ones that are pointing in another direction, that doesn't mean they're wrong. They actually require some investigation. And what you always find in accident analyses is that the culturals look pretty good at a sort of surface level, but there were issues underneath. Wendy, I'll come to you. What if there were sort of 2 or 3 key cultural indicators that, I'm putting you on the spot here a bit, that would tell you about that kind of smoke detector aspect that you think are very reliable, and they may not be ones that you could put a number on, they may be more informal. What would you argue? Could you give us some ideas here on what they might be?
You really are putting me on the spot
here.
here.
Sorry.
So look, I would say, and it's one that's perhaps coming to mind a little bit too late, but it is exit interviews, so an analysis of exit interviews. I would say, you look at your data in terms of breaches that you have within the organization. And so look, that could be very specific to the role or the activity, but you want to look at breaches. And again, back to why was that decision taken? It's not as simple as, okay, we made a mistake. You should be looking at why was that mistake made, or any points where there's been a missed escalation. So do you track escalations, but do you track something that wasn't escalated? And do you discuss those afterwards, or do you do a post-mortem to understand not just, okay, there was an error and there's a business impact, but there was an error. What were the drivers of the behavior around that? And just to add one other point, that those things will all differ. So we're talking about culture, but there's multiple cultures within an organization, and all of that stuff needs to be taken with consideration of us working in global organizations with people digesting information differently, people responding to hierarchies differently, et cetera. So it's a complex organization, but look, everything is possible to manage. We just need to stay focused on what are types of indicators that we could use and start a benchmark.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think exit interviews are a bit like complaints. They're painful, but they can be people telling you, freed from the culture, almost freed from the organization. They're able to unload, and sometimes you hear the unloading a bit, don't you? And you think, well, that's but actually they can be telling you something that's quite important, and they might even have left for or be leaving because of the culture. I think that's very a powerful data set. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get into it today, but and we've talked about this before, Wendy. It's about that link between a bigger national cultural environment, say, and an organizational culture. There's quite powerful associations between those, and you're absolutely right that groups can form their own subcultures, and that can be quite hard to pick up on, actually, when you have a subculture that's just gone off out there. That's difficult to pick up. That's when unobtrusive data is very powerful. Jason, I'm going to give the last word to you, though, on from the perspective of the sovereign wealth funds and the like. Where do you see culture measurement going? What are the kind of cultural indicators that you think will be important going forward?
So I think, thanks for that, Tom. I think a couple of headline points. One, measuring the culture again, I think, so insofar as you survey it through conduct, is a whole 360 holistic view. There's no one single indicator. There's no one single metric. You have to look at things. But having said that, I think there are a couple of areas where I think it's important to focus, and I'll just mention 3. One, the data sets, as what Kate is doing, having a look at the data sets itself and whether the data manifests itself in communications, in picking up how decisions are made, and so on. In a very scientific way, I think lends itself to a good analysis. And and more importantly, also removes anecdotal issues and some sort of gossip and just complaints for the sake of complaints. So you have the data itself, and I think with AI and ML tools, it's a good start on this. So that's one. Secondly, you shouldn't underestimate, as Wendy mentioned, polling or actually looking at the stakeholders of the organization. And this doesn't mean employees themselves, shareholders, the investors, in case of us, the governments and so on. So it's actually looking at the community which we serve. So it's a real 360, as you say, right? Your students in LSE, they're important stakeholders to determine the culture. So I think that's important, the second point. And the third point, to me, one of the key things which I've always believed, right, and is the turnover of staff, and specifically turnover of staff in the control functions. If you have an organization which has a high turnover in the control functions, whether it's audit, compliance, legal, and so on, that really points to something. Maybe they're just lowly paid. Well, that could be how important they are viewed in the organization. And that's also a high correlation. Now, we like to say everyone is their own culture and conduct officer, but there is also correlation in how the control functions are viewed in an organization and with positive cultural outcomes. So I will just summarize in those three things. Data, making sure you get the right stakeholders to opine, and also just look at the turnover specifically in the control functions.
Okay, thank you very much, Jason. Kate, Wendy, Jason, thanks for attending the panel. It's been a great discussion, and hopefully we'll pick up the discussion again about culture going forward. And actually, who knows, in 2 or 3 years, maybe we'll have some kind of industry dashboard or something like that. Who knows? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.